Hey, it's Matt Sager. This might be a little bit darker than you're used to from me at this point, but I really want to talk about a movie currently airing on Netflix. It's a Netflix exclusive after having had a limited run in, I think, November of 2019. I'm not a huge Saturday Night Live fan these days. I think it's okay. I think it's really important, these remote Zoom versions of the show that have been going on during this pandemic. It's helping everyone feel a little bit more normal and less lonely. And in these crazy political times, I don't know. I'll be honest. I think sometimes they beat these points to death. I think having a valid argument to make about the terrible, awful, polarizing situation this country's in is different than having an enjoyable, funny show. They're doing their best. But I don't think, for instance, as beloved as these segments are, that Alec Baldwin does a particularly good impression of Donald Trump. Trump is really hard to do. There's like one guy from The President Show that used to air on Comedy Central. He nailed Trump, but Trump has a lot of weird affects, a weird posture, a weird voice, strange breathing. He's hard to do, and Alec Baldwin just plays him the way he perhaps perceives him to be. It's not a good impression. And as much as I would love to laugh at the awfulness that's going on in this country, I don't think they do a great job. I do, for instance, think Darrell Hammond did a better Trump. And I'd actually heard about Darrell Hammond a couple of years back, something to the effect of, again, not being an avid SNL fan, I wasn't that aware of Darrell Hammond's tenure on the show. But I'd read words to the effect of he saw Alec Baldwin replacing him as Trump on the show, and it caused him to have a nervous breakdown and a deep depression. And that struck me as a bit over the top. I certainly know from depression and breakdowns. And I know about how working in the entertainment industry can take a stressful situation, a person who's prone to stress and depression and stuff like that, and intensify it greatly. So it didn't shock me. I didn't find it beyond belief, but it seemed like a rather simple explanation for something that's very complex, like a breakdown. And it turns out whatever I heard, whoever told me, wherever it was written, that Darrell Hammond watched Alec Baldwin as Trump and that ruined his world, that is not at all what happened. The timeline isn't right. The series of events that caused the breakdown isn't correct. And in fact, Darrell Hammond has a long, very sad, deeply complex, and only recently stuff that he's aware of because of buried memories and trauma. He's got a story that needed to be told. That's really important that it's out there. And it's on Netflix right now in the form of Cracked Up, the Darrell Hammond story. You can read some of this stuff in the memoir that Hammond published in 2011 called God, If You're Not Up There, I'm Fucked. Tales of Stand-Up, Saturday Night Live, and Other Mind-Altering Mayhem. He talks a lot about his self-destructive behavior, his physical and psychological trauma, and the way he was dealing with it, the way it had affected his tenure on SNL. But this movie goes much deeper into stuff that Hammond only realized later in life after the publication of his book. And at the time of this film, he was actually speaking out about it for the first time in a one-man show. So you get to see a lot of that as he narrates it from Caroline's Comedy Club in New York, from their stage. But way beyond that, Hammond takes us on a tour, quite physically, in the form of going back to his childhood home, and emotionally, as he and people who have worked with him, doctors and trauma specialists, describe in great detail how Hammond's life as an adult was self-destructive and how the seeds of that destruction were planted in an incredibly traumatic childhood. This is really important stuff that people don't talk about. To hear about it from someone who has been a comedian, an entertainer, makes it feel all the more important, and not because of the stereotypical Pagliacci, the sad clown, tropes, but because a lot of us, people who have been hurt, people who are trying to ignore that hurt and just go through life like everything's okay, it will come out in self-destructive ways. Seeds are planted that you cannot ignore. And one of the chief ways, speaking from more experience than I would like, that people with trauma from childhood deal with it as an adult is through comedy. And comedy is great for that. But comedy as a replacement for dealing with trauma is not enough. Childhood trauma literally changes your brain's structure. prevents it from growing in certain ways, causes it to grow in other ways, lays traps that the most funny, seemingly well put together and recovered adult, if you don't deal with this, if they don't deal with this, the consequences are real and in many cases unavoidable. I'm living with some of them myself. I'm trying very hard to not go into too much detail on this podcast because this gets very deep, very close to my personal life, very close to my soul. And I'm not trying to talk overly much about medical conditions I deal with. This is not what my podcast is about. That said, I do have a lot of autoimmune disorders, a lot of inflammation. These are things that are physically caused by childhood trauma. Some outrageous number of people who've had trauma as a child, you'll experience this in the form of stuff like, well, in my case, any number of disorders and syndromes that, again, I'm going to try and not get specific about, but I've got serious nerve pain, serious nervous system disruption, and again, childhood trauma will do this to you. Being on Saturday Night Live, doing a great Donald Trump and a great Bill Clinton won't help you. In the case of Darrell Hammond, it can also lead, and in the case of many others, it can lead to very dangerously self-destructive behavior as well. All of that is discussed in his book, and it's explored in much greater detail in Cracked Up. And again, when this becomes something that's involved with the entertainment industry, it becomes much more complicated, difficult to manage, and it becomes the responsibility, if you're the boss of someone who's going through something this serious, and you're leveraging their talent, using it for your gain. In the case of Lorne Michaels, executive producer of Saturday Night Live, you've got this brilliant comedic talent with the penchant for darkness you don't quite understand. Michaels is one of many people involved in Darrell Hammond's life who's interviewed for this film, and he describes Hammond as a, quote, big game player, and he discusses when Hammond would go into the dark place. He said, quote, it always happened off stage, but he went on to say, quote, the part of Darrell that's fragile is sort of my job to protect. I can't imagine what it's like for somebody like Lorne Michaels dealing with someone who's brilliant and deeply suffering, deeply mentally ill, struggling with substance abuse, having panic attacks. Lorne Michaels, after all, has been through Chris Farley. He's been through John Belushi. He's a guy who sees, who's lived through this bizarre through line that often takes place between comedy genius and serious mental trauma. And he's seen that it can go down an awful dark path, that it can lead to literally death. Darrell Hammond was a cutter during his time on Saturday Night Live. He discusses this in the film. He's deeply scarred, not just emotionally. He has 49 severe laceration scars on his arm. He talks about why cutters cut. And look, as long as I'm discussing my personal life, which I don't mind telling you is super uncomfortable for me, I am not a cutter, never have been. I understand it though. Darrell Hammond articulates it very well. When you feel as though you've got no control over anything, you reach, look for ways to find a form of control. Cutting is a form of control. There are other methods, probably in their own way, differently destructive. I've never understood or sought solace in that kind of self-harm. But they speak with a lot of people in this film. I honestly can't recommend it highly enough. Doesn't matter if you're a fan of Darrell Hammond's. I was very unfamiliar with him when I watched it. It's a movie about the effects of childhood trauma in adulthood. Whether or not you've suffered it, I think it's very likely you know someone who has and who's not discussing it. It is an epidemic, something that goes on all the time in this country. Darrell Hammond reunites with childhood friends in this movie, people who knew his father, who was the local baseball coach, who couldn't believe the things they'd read in Hammond's book. Couldn't believe that Hammond had endured what he'd endured, primarily at the hands of his mother, who was... This is a tough watch. She hurt him really bad, but his father was around for it. He was aware of it, and they just didn't discuss it. That's a big part of childhood trauma. It's pretty amazing. There is a moment in Hammond's life. This is during the Saturday Night Live years. At one point, Lorne Michaels decided they would have a Mother's Day special. And the cast would invite their mothers to the show. And Hammond said, no, not my mother. Michaels was not particularly shocked by this because he knew that there was some kind of complicated history with Hammond and his mother. Hammond himself hadn't really recovered the memories. He just knew that there was something bad. and he'd done impressions of his mother. So Michael says, hey, why don't you dress as your mom? Do a character of your mom. And Darrell Hammond, backstage, guy who lived to be done up as characters, who did Clinton so well that Bill Clinton hosted him at several events as his doppelganger, dressed as his own mother, began to get into character in his dressing room, looked in the mirror, and went into a state of such shock and high heart rate and blood pressure that he was rushed to the hospital for fear that he was having a severe heart attack. And still, he hadn't figured out how bad his past was. It still hadn't come to the surface. That's the really bad thing about trauma, is it sort of burrows, leaves a wound, and then hides there, making the wound worse. To actually get at it is really difficult. And in Hammond's case, it involved many trips to rehab, any number of involuntary stays at mental hospitals, being committed again and again, having his marriage destroyed, losing touch with his daughter, having her be estranged, the most important thing in his life, all the best parts of his adulthood, having lost them in one form or another, only to finally eventually discover, by sheer luck of being institutionalized one time and getting one right doctor to diagnose him correctly. Without this doctor, Hammond would likely have died. Without the doctor saying, you've got trauma, I'm going to help you unearth it. Because you don't have bipolar disorder. You don't have multiple personalities. You may well at this point be addicted to various substances, but most of the diagnoses I've seen for you, they're not correct. No one is this crazy. You've got trauma. I'm going to help you unearth it. And this doctor is involved in this documentary as well. It's really heart-wrenching, painful, and beautiful. To know that no matter how bad things get, you can escape, but to know how bad things can get. This is not necessarily a fun, happy watch. It's not the story of Darrell Hammond, the funny guy who does Bill Clinton impressions, although that's certainly a big part of it. And there is a lot of beauty in knowing that Hammond went through this all and came out the other side and seems genuinely really optimistic and happy. And in a healthy way, he's turning his trauma into art. That's a big, big deal. My point is, this is not a family, fun time, feel-good movie. It's a lot more complicated than that, but it's really special. I think it's really important. I think it's really beautiful. I could hardly recommend it highly enough. It's a behind-the-scenes look at entertainment, and it's a behind-the-scenes look at what a lot of entertainers and people in the industry go through. I never thought it was a coincidence that so many people in the industry are damaged in one way or another. I think holes that we have from our childhood are one of the reasons that certain of us enter the entertainment industry to begin with, and why displaying so much crazy talent that we've built up from years of loneliness in childhood, why that seems to coincide, to go directly with this self-destructive streak that I don't think I've got, but that I understand, and that I like to think, like Hammond, to the extent I have sabotaged myself. I too, look, Darrell Hammond goes through it in this movie, but there are certain modalities of therapy you do for PTSD, and PTSD that occurred when your brain was forming. I've done that, and I continue to do that, and my life is on a very even keel. I'm ecstatically happy, in the best relationship of my life with the woman I love, doing really well. But it was still really a bit shocking for me to stumble upon this movie and to, I hate to use the word triggered, but to see a story that felt so reminiscent to me. Darrell Hammond's first way of communicating with his mom was by doing impressions. His first job was at a local radio station doing cartoon voices. There are a lot of places where this movie gets me right in the feels and scares me. But Hammond's doing fantastically. For what it's worth, I'm doing fantastically. And regardless of where you are in your life, whether it involves entertainment, whether you're dealing with trauma, whether you just want to watch a really interesting movie about one form of the human condition, that whether or not you've seen it, lived with it, or encountered it, probably someone you know or someone you know knows is living with. It shouldn't be a silent problem. It shouldn't be forbidden to be talked about. And it's beautiful that Darrell Hammond gets to tell his story. Cracked Up is on Netflix now, and I recommend it very highly. Thanks as always. Please feel free to leave comments. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'd love it if you subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, like, and share it. If you're listening on a podcast network or app, please subscribe there. I'd love it if you left me reviews as well. There's also links in the description for how you can follow me on social media, and how you can contribute to this podcast. Please feel free to interact with me in any and all of those ways, and I will talk with you soon.